Hello, friends. I wanted to follow up kind of quickly with the last session that we had and talk a little bit more about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And what I wanted to do was remind you why we're doing it in the first place. The reason we're talking about aggregate supply and aggregate demand is because by, by, by looking at those two forces colliding together in a macroeconomy, we can determine how the level of output and price level is established, right? And those are important things, right? So we talked about aggregate demand, and you've studied that, I hope, and you recognize that it's the level of consumption demand, consumer demand, business demand, investment, government demand, government spending at every level, and foreign demand minus what we demand from foreign countries, right? And we said that formula is C plus I sub G plus G plus X sub N, right? And that equals AD. Aggregate supply, where we have been focusing a little bit of our attention recently, is the amount of output that firms will want to produce at every price level. And we explained that in the short run, as price level goes up, so does firms' desire to produce output. And that's largely because in the short run, input prices are fixed. So when output prices go up, firms' profitability increases and they have an incentive to expand their output. Well, okay, right? We talked about that. And then we also talked about changes in aggregate supply in the most recent session. We said, look, if we hold price level constant, what could cause firms to want to produce more or less of basically all products? And we said, well, a change in the per unit cost of production, right? That input prices establish a per unit cost of production. And if that per unit cost of production changes, then it will shift the aggregate supply curve. If it goes down, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. If it goes up, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. And we said if we looked at our textbook, which I'm quite sure you will not, but if you did, you would see in there that there are three things that your text authors mention as potential shifters or determinants of aggregate supply. And those are input prices, both foreign and domestic, productivity, which we especially focused on last time, and we said that productivity is defined as the value of output you get per unit of input, and that productivity is a really, really big deal, right? It's a really big deal. Nothing bad happens when the economy becomes more productive, or but basically the labor force becomes more productive. Nothing bad happens when that occurs. And then lastly, the legal governmental structure, regulation, taxes, whatever might increase or decrease the per unit cost of production. And we said depending upon how these things vary, the aggregate short run aggregate supply curve could shift right or shift left. And when it does, then we have a new short run, right? And remember, we always live in the short run. And, the long run never really comes. The long run is always the long run. The short run is where we exist, right? So, okay, right now, what we want to do is put these two things together. So what I would like you to do is get a piece of paper, right? Like I've asked you to do before, or at least humor me. I'll just convince myself that you've got a piece of paper in front of you, right? So take a second, get a piece of paper, and once you have it, I want you to draw the traditional economic graph, a vertical axis, right? And on that vertical axis, I want you to put PL, that's price level, a horizontal axis, and I want you to put output there, and you can put in parentheses GDP. You don't have to. They're the same things. I want you to draw a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, and at the bottom, put AD, and then put equals C plus I sub G plus G plus X sub N. So when you draw that aggregate demand curve, right, put down there AD, aggregate demand, at the bottom of it, at the very bottom of it, base of it, and then put C plus I sub G plus G plus X sub N. Now I want you to draw the aggregate supply curve, but I don't want you to draw a straight line up, right? I want you to draw it sort of bowed, right? So a flattening part, a rising part, and then up, right? So now we've combined in the same illustration. Oh, and on that one, I want you to put AS. Let's even do this just for fun, since this will be your, your number one illustration of this. Put short run SRAS, short run aggregate supply. In the future, we'll just put AS, but we'll put short run aggregate supply there now. Okay. So then, with these two forces together in the macro economy, what happens, right? What happens? Well, what obviously happens is that there is an equilibrium, and you can see it there. You can see where they intersect, right? And if you draw where they intersect over to the price level axis, the vertical axis, and put PL1 there, we would say at that price level, firms want to produce exactly the amount of goods and services consumers, businesses, government, and foreigners want to buy, right? So we say at equilibrium in the macroeconomy, aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, the amount that firms want to produce based on the per unit cost of production, their proposed profitability, is exactly the amount, right, that people want to buy. So if this is the case, the output that firms want to produce, you go down in there, you would put output is exactly the output that people want to buy. So firms are selling everything that they are producing at that output, and people are buying everything that they want to buy at that price level, right? So then we would say that there is no incentive for firms to produce more or less, right? This is macroeconomic equilibrium, right? Now, just for fun, let's do this. Let's put, when you have the equilibrium and you go over and you put PL1, let's drop down to the horizontal axis and let's call that output full, OF. OF, output full. Well, okay, if that's full employment, this is nirvana, this is heaven. Because now what we have is equilibrium, right? The economy is going to gravitate to equilibrium, right? If it's not at equilibrium, right? If it's not at equilibrium, if the price level is higher or lower than that, the output is going to be greater than what people want to buy, or the output is going to be less than what people want to buy, and then output is and price level are going to adjust back to equilibrium on their own without any intervention from anyone. I mean, the forces of aggregate supply and aggregate demand are going to come together, and it's going to gravitate towards equilibrium like any equilibrium, right? But if that equilibrium level of output is equal to the full employment level of output, then the economy is going to gravitate towards full employment. Basically, in the short run, this is what we want. We want equilibrium and full employment to be in the same place. So let's just make that full employment for now. And let's make that line, just for fun, that we draw from the equilibrium, intersection there, down to the bottom, down to there. Let's call that O sub F. But let's extend that line beyond the X up. Right? Okay. Right? So now what we have is a full employment equilibrium. This is what we want. But this is not what we always have. Right? We don't always have a full employment equilibrium. Right? So what happens here? Why is there a business cycle? That's why we're in this discussion in the first place. So let's do this. Let's say that for one reason or another, right, one of the components of aggregate demand autonomously change, right? Meaning autonomously from price level. They change. So here's what's interesting. The most likely culprit in a change in demand is investment spending, right? Consumer spending is relatively stable. If income remains the same, people buy about the same, right? There's a reliable relationship. It could change, but it's relatively stable, right? In fact, most recently, the economic prosperity that we were enjoying in the United States was consumer spending driven, right? And that's pretty stable, and okay, good. Investment spending has historically been unstable. It's varied wildly, right? Wildly. There are times where there's just a lot of business spending on capital, like when they built the railroads in the United States, and that investments. And Keynes called this the animal spirit. When you build a railroad and you make a lot of money, another guy says, "Wow, you built a railroad," and there's all sorts of things. In the '90s, in the tech bubble, lots of people bought. Lots of firms invested in technology and things of that nature. So investment, can vary. Then people panic. Everything's built, and it goes down. It goes up, it goes down. So let's say for some reason, in this condition of macroeconomic equilibrium, firms come to believe that some kind of capital, some kind of technology capital is going to be the wave of the future. So they decide to spend a lot more on that, right? There's an expectation that this is something that they're going to need. So what I'm saying is that I sub G increases substantially autonomously, right? It just goes up. How would that affect the model? Well, do it. I mean, basically now, the entire C plus I plus X plus G, or G plus X curve, would shift rightward. So shift it rightward, right? Shift it rightward. Now, what do you see happening here, right? What you see happening is the equilibrium changing. Now, what some of you are going to say is, whoa, kind instructor, elderly retired instructor, you said we were at full employment, and now there's a level of output beyond full employment. How can that be? Right? Well, here's the thing. Full employment at the natural rate means that you're at the natural rate of unemployment. That's the level of output at the natural rate in the short run, right? It's possible to produce slightly more than that. Right? Now you might say, well, how? Well, think about this. If you're working and full employment means there's a job for everyone that wants it. The only people that are unemployed are people who are looking for a job and people who are training for a job. So there are jobs for everybody who wants it. Now, right now, we are not full employment because there aren't jobs for everybody that wants it. But in full employment, there are jobs for everybody who wants it. There's still going to be some level of unemployment, and that's the natural rate, right? Okay, right? But people who are out of the workforce can be lured back in, right? Um, People can work overtime. People can hold multiple jobs. So there is some potential to produce beyond the natural rate of unemployment in the short run, right? Not in the long run, but in the short run. Now, in the short run, that's possible. But look what happens. You can produce more output, but at the expense of higher prices, right? And so that price level going up and output should be only slightly going up, because if you drew your curve correctly, it should be kind of getting towards being vertical. And when you get vertical, that's when you reach capacity, right? You can't produce anything more, right? What you have here is what we call demand pull inflation. What drove prices up was an increase in demand pull inflation. You know, in the most recent prosperity, there was some fears of this. Demand pull inflation. It really didn't fully materialize. Demand pull inflation, but there were fears of it, demand pull inflation, and we've had periods of demand pull inflation where really what the reason that prices are going up is because demand is outpacing the potential for the economy to meet that demand. So firms respond not by producing more, but by raising prices. Right? I mean, this is one potential problem that could occur at the peak of a business cycle. All right. Now, let's say something else happens. Let's say that there is some major world catastrophe. Well, that's relevant. That causes both businesses and consumers to decide to spend less, that future expectations are grim, right? Now, right now, what would happen? Well, that aggregate demand curve would shift leftward. Well, go ahead and do that. Now, I want to note something here. If we look at what happens when you did that, you would see an equilibrium where price levels declined, right? That'd be one point. But if you go on that original price level line and you look at where your demand shifted there, put that point there and you just put an A there, right? and put below there the other point of B, right? Because here's the thing. Demand pull inflation, like you saw, like you illustrated there, is pretty much what happens. Aggregate demand goes up and output increases slightly, because of, you're pretty close to potential, right, in the short run, and you get higher prices. But prices don't fall typically. Since the Great Depression, there probably only been a few quarters or months where you actually had what we would call deflation. Most of the time, you have some level of inflation, right? So, this circumstance, your B point, lower prices, right, is pretty unlikely. At least in the short run, it's more likely that you'll go to A, right? That stay with stable prices. But note what happens with output. If you look at output, it goes down more. If prices fall, then output doesn't decline below full employment as much than if prices remain stable. Now, when that output level moves below full employment, that's a recession, right? Now you don't have as much economic activity as necessary to fully employ the economy. There isn't a job for everyone, right? This is a recession. This recession occurred because of a reduction in demand. Fundamentally, that's what's happening now. I mean, you could argue that, we were at a full employment equilibrium, maybe even, you know, verging on being beyond that, right? But now, because of some outside factor, there's a dramatic reduction in demand for lots and lots of things. Right now, in the short run, we would say that prices tend to be sticky downward, so that firms will cut their output dramatically and will be in this recession, right? In the short run, we'll be at point A. Now you could even push it further. I mean, depending upon the magnitude of the reduction of demand, you could push it even further, and you're in a deeper recession. Well, why are you in a deeper recession? You're in a deeper recession because of a reduction in demand, right? Now you might say, well, okay. I mean, just one last thing. I know this is a lengthy video now, but you might say, well, okay, well, why is there a regular cycle like that? I mean, this is a special circumstance. Why is it typically up and down in the business cycle? Well, the culprit in it all is investment spending. The booms and the busts tend to be surround that, right? There's a boom in business spending on some kind of new big thing, right? That stimulates economic activity and drives the economy to full employment, even potentially inflation. Then it's all built, it peters out, right? And then investment spend is small. And if you look at the level of investment spending, it tends to mirror, right, the business cycle, right? Keynes is going to call this the animal spirit. Now, not everyone agrees with that. I mean, some thinkers say, "Oh, no. This is more has to do with money and monetary policy and things of that nature." But and you'll talk about that later. But for now, we're saying that you could have two circumstances in the economy. Well, three that we talked about: a macroeconomic equilibrium and full employment, a circumstance where demand is beyond full employment, demand pull inflation, or a circumstance where demand is below full employment. Basically, we're saying there's not enough demand to buy the full employment level of GDP. So as a result of that, right, we have a recession. Okay, we got to add supply to this, but I'm pushing my luck to go any further than this. Hopefully you understand this. If you ever have any questions, and you've put them on for me, Mr. Spinola obviously, is in contact with you, and I'm sure he can respond to your questions. But if you had anything that you wanted to mention to me, if you put it on the YouTube channel on the comments, I'll see it there. Otherwise, best wishes to you.